Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. It's that special time of year. The nights are getting longer, the days are getting colder, there's snow on the ground if you don't live in a desert like I do, and most importantly, there's a new Star Wars movie. To celebrate the release of The Last Jedi, I wanted to take a look at the composition of my favorite Star Wars song, the Imperial March. But first, a couple caveats. I don't really want to get into a copyright battle with a legal team from Disney, so I'm not going to be playing the actual recording. Instead, I'll just use a piano reduction. Don't worry, all the important parts will still be there. And second, because it's a giant orchestral piece with a million things going on, I'm just going to focus on the most iconic part, the first 16 bars, which starts like this. Now, I don't know about you, but that's all I need to hear to know that Vader is coming. That's because this song is an example of what's called a leitmotif, which is a piece of music associated with a specific character. Another famous leitmotif is this one, also by John Williams, which actually represents a pretty similar character. Leitmotifs are a really useful tool in operas and film scoring because they weave the narrative and the music together, letting you tell a richer, more complex story. And understanding the story the Imperial March is telling starts with a rhythm. It's a brilliant pattern. I could strip away all the notes and it'd still sound great. Here it is on a woodblock, and I think it's still pretty recognizable. Why? Well, it all comes down to how it builds urgency through the bar. We start with this nice stately quarter note, then on beat 2 we start to hear this militaristic marching triplet figure on the upbeats, and then finally on beat 4 the rhythm gets so excited that it jumps the gun and plays the triplet figure first. Then, with that release of tension, we go back to the beginning and do it all over again. In fact, we keep doing it forever. This same rhythmic theme in one form or another continues for pretty much the entire song. Honestly, more than anything else, this rhythmic pattern is the Imperial March. But just because we don't need notes doesn't mean they don't help. We start with this, which is just one note, G, played in 3 different octaves. Given the dark, dramatic feel of the piece, though, I'm gonna say that this is implying a G minor chord, even though we're missing a few notes. That plays for the first 3 beats, then at the same time as that rhythmic release, we switch to this, which is an E-flat minor triad. This is interesting because we were just playing a whole bunch of G naturals, and suddenly we've got E-flat minor, which has a G flat. This is what's called a chromatic mediant, which is a chord whose root is a third away, but that alters one of the notes that should be kept the same. Of course, we weren't actually playing a real G minor chord, but again, I think that's what's implied. Anyway, after playing that twice, we hear this, which is a little harder to sort out. We've got these 5 notes, and while it may seem like a random jumble of sounds, if you look closely, there's actually still an E-flat minor chord in there. We've got E-flat, G-flat, and B-flat, it's just we also have these G naturals and this A. The G is easier to explain, so let's start there. It's what's called a pedal, which is when you take a note you've been playing and just keep playing it even though it doesn't fit with the chord anymore. Basically, we've been hanging out with G for the whole bar, so we're just letting it chill with us a little bit longer, and we're not too worried that it wasn't technically invited. The A, on the other hand, is a little harder to explain, and really, I think that's the point. Williams is trying to add dissonance, and what better way than by introducing a really weird note that doesn't fit with what we're trying to do. Technically speaking, it's called the sharp 11, meaning it's a tritone above the root and a half step below the 5th, both of which are really unpleasant intervals that add a lot of tension. Plus, we almost never see the sharp 11 over minor chords. Combining it with the flat third implies a really weird scale, to say the least. Next we go to this section, where the main melody comes in. The accompaniment stays the same and the melody is really simple. There's not a lot of motion to it, it's mostly just sitting on G with occasional interruptions from this E-flat, B-flat figure. It almost feels like it's breathing, with the melody kind of opening and closing. It gives it a regal feel, like a calm, powerful presence contrasted against the urgent, chaotic background, which is a pretty good metaphor for Darth Vader. The one bit that stands out to me is this 16th note, which isn't a big deal on its own, but since the harmony part's been playing 16th note triplets, this gives us a bit of a rhythmic rub between the two. Anyway, we follow that up with this, which is fairly similar. The notes have changed and the melody starts on the 5th degree of the key now, but the overall structure is the same. The only really noteworthy part is this G flat, which is the first time the melody's ventured outside the key of G minor, and the harmony accents that by moving to E flat minor again. Then we go back to G minor, then this figure appears, which reminds me of what's called a line cliche. This is when you take a chord and just move one note in it to create a sense of motion over static harmony. Here he's moving 2 notes a major third apart, but the principle is the same and it helps ramp up into the next section, which sounds like this. There's a lot to talk about here, but let's start with the melody. Where before it was fairly simple, sticking largely to one key, here we've got something much more complex. We start with this octave leap. Large jumps like this are often used to convey a sense of power, and there's few people in Star Wars more powerful than Vader. Next we start to slide down a half step at a time, until we get to this half-step trill. This is a stark contrast to the giant leap we just saw. Here we're moving as little as possible, stopping at every note along the way. This gives a sense of restraint and control and paints Vader as a master of his own power. We're also again seeing 16th notes contrasting against the accompanying rhythm. After that we have this, which is another leap, although smaller. This interrupts the smooth slide downward and adds a bit of extra flavor that wouldn't have been there if we just stuck to the half steps the entire time. Then we repeat that whole figure again, but lower down, before ending with this, which evokes the melody from earlier, but by ending on the D instead of the G, it implies forward motion. This melody isn't done. But before we keep going, let's talk harmony, because there's a lot of it. It starts like this, which is just those octave Gs from earlier, but with a descending line cliche that sets up the next chord, a C-sharp minor. This is a really dark sound because C-sharp is a tritone away from G, the root of the key. And for even more dissonance, he ends the bar with this, a pair of augmented major 7 chords. These are a weird, complex sound that's pretty hard to use in a normal context, but here they brush by so quickly that they don't really register. They just sound like non-specific dissonance that complements the melody. Then we see this, another E-flat minor chord, which we're pretty familiar with by now. The rhythm's interesting though. They break their typical pattern and just play the first half twice, and I'm honestly not sure why. If you have any guesses, let me know in the comments. Anyway, the section wraps up with this bar, which starts out on the Gs we're used to, then transitions to an E-flat chord, but this time it's major. This is actually in the key of G minor, so this gives us a bit more of a sense of rest and resolution. Then we go back to our Gs with a brief incursion by some F sharps and Ds to add a bit more, you know, harmony. After that we go to this section, which is pretty similar to the last. The melody is almost identical, but where before we ended on the D, implying further motion, here we land on a G, creating a sense of rest. This is an example of what's called a period, that is, 2 musical phrases where the first asks a question and the second answers it. The other thing that happens is that the melody, played by the horns, starts to harmonize itself. Until now, the trumpets and trombones have all been doubling each other, but at a couple points in this melody, they actually split off into full chords. This helps create a bit more interest, since the melody itself isn't changing much. The harmony's similar too, but not identical. It starts with this bar, where we see E-flat major again. Major chords are really rare in this piece, so emphasizing it here is an interesting choice that gives us a sense of hopefulness, although it doesn't last long, going back into the descending figure we saw last time to set up C-sharp minor, with another descending figure at the end echoing the melody, then back to E-flat minor, with the last beat switching to a C minor 7 flat 5 instead, which isn't as weird as you'd think. It's just all the notes of E-flat minor again, but with an extra C in the bass. Again, same structure, just a bit more decoration. Finally, we end with this, which uses the same C minor 7 flat 5 before finally ending on those octave Gs. And that's it. Well, that's the first 16 bars anyway. If you're the sort of person who enjoys score study, John Williams is a master and I highly recommend you check it out. And go see Last Jedi. Or don't. They're not paying me or anything. I just like the song. Anyway, thanks for watching and thanks to Patreon patron Jeff Hook for suggesting this song. If you'd like to see your favorite song analyzed, just head on over to Patreon and pledge at any level. You can also check out our store, join our mailing list, like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.